Hello, everyone. Welcome to my mom's basement, where I'm joining you from in Saskatoon, in Canada. Uh, I'm sure Adi and Hannah and Jared have already done a really awesome job with the first bit to our presentation, and I'm going to cap it off with a look at a second case study, which is Vice Media and the 2014 documentary, The Islamic State. So Vice is now 11 media companies under one big umbrella of Vice Media, but they started off as a pretty modest little counterculture magazine in Montreal in 1994. For the longest time, they operated in relative obscurity. And then sometime around 2007, 2008, they got a little bit more ambitious and started hiring up people from the BBC and CNN and Al Jazeera and turned their focus away from their classic niches of drugs and sex and gross things and tried to go a little bit more mainstream. They tried to become a bit more of a legit purveyor of news. And they did so with a really heavy reliance on film and a really heavy reliance on online film specifically. So in this week's reading, when Stephen Ward refers to the emergence of a mixed news media that is interactive and online, Vice is the shining example of that. They also have started to take money from HBO and A&E and 21st Century Fox because, of course, they need money if they're going to expand and pay all these new staffers. But that's led to a bit of a crisis of identity because they are still kind of wedded to their past and they need to still show that they're cool, but they need to also show that they've grown up enough to be considered, a legit competitor to people like the New York Times, which is what they are trying to do ultimately. So the result basically is right now they're basically an entertainment company masquerading as or with ambitions to become as news. But in 2014, in any case, they got pretty remarkable access to the Islamic State, which was at that point still kind of not really on the map. Then they sent this actually relatively green reporter named Median Daria to spend 3 weeks with ISIS. So he just drove around with them, observed their mundane everyday habits, spent time with the religious police, wandered around their jails, and just portrayed it as it was, according to some. Some people praised it, went on to win a lot of awards. Everyone said, what a wonderful piece of fly-on-the-wall journalism this is. Of course, its timing, the release of it, was a bit awkward. It came out 5 days after the execution of the American journalist James Foley by Islamic State. So that did cause a bit of controversy. And of course, some of the discussions that emerged about a week after it came out and people had a little bit more time to reflect on what they'd just seen were, how on earth did you get access to this? Was it through legitimate means or was it through kind of backdoor bribery dealings? And are you kind of collaborating with a terrorist organization? Another one was, how much creative control did you really have over the end product? Surely some of these scenes were a bit tidied up by Islamic State before you arrived there because they were basically driving around with the press officers of Islamic State the whole time they were filming this. There were a lot of questions, but the ones I want to focus on would be, first, in our reading this week, Stephen Ward brings up the idea of personalized ethics. So he describes this as a condition of the fragmentation of new media, wherein media platforms need to devise their own ethical guidelines. It becomes up to them to decide the codes of practice, basically. Well, Vice deliberately blurs the line between the subject and the producer. They do not believe in objective journalism. They go for immersive journalism and gonzo-style journalism. So their founder, Shane Smith, in an interview with the New York Times, stated in no uncertain terms, I don't believe in objective news because no one is really objective. I don't believe in objectivity. It's fake, so we don't do it. So not to start a debate between empiricism and relativism here, but basically I want to ask, is it okay that one of the fastest growing news media companies in the world is explicitly anti-objective? Then again, on the other hand, maybe this is exactly a form of transparency journalism, which Stephen Ward brings up in our reading from this week as well. Another consideration, though, from an ethical standpoint, is Vice's use of freelancers, like the person who is narrating this piece, Median, who produced Islamic State. Vice is really fond of using freelancers because they can get access to niche populations. They're more willing to prove themselves because they don't have much to lose, and they also don't have to pay them as much generally. But the problem is, of course, freelancers are very much results-based. They are not transparent necessarily in the means by which they went about getting this footage. So that was one of the big questions that was brought up as soon as Vice released this was, how on earth did you get footage of this sort without being put at risk? Who knows? No one knows. It's like their version of Facebook's algorithm. They're not going to divulge their secrets. It's basically it's a consequentialist framework. They're saying, look at what we've got, and don't worry yourselves with how we went about getting it. Another really big one, though, is the ethics of collaboration. So Vice's access to and partnership with Islamic State's press corps raises a lot of red flags for me. One again is around creative control. So you have to ask yourself, how much control would a media company like Vice have over the final product when their co-producers, so to speak, Islamic State, are men carrying AK-47s? It's probably not out of the realm of possibility that had they spoken to those same prisoners who appear in the documentary off the record, they probably would have gotten a very different story, one that was a little bit more honest and that didn't praise Islamic State. Another big one is that collaborating with Islamic State, at least in the US, might actually be illegal. This documentary might actually be grounds for a pretty major legal case against Vice. The Atlantic magazine published an article with a nice leading title, "Is Vice's documentary on ISIS illegal?" In which they argued that the terms by which this footage was produced might fall underneath the definition of a law which prohibits providing material support for a terrorist organization. Incidentally, that's the same law that was invoked by the US government, which prevented the families of James Foley and Stephen Sotloff from paying ransoms to Islamic State for their release, and ultimately led to their execution. So the problem with Vice's approach then, and with Islamic State, the documentary, is that it's really difficult to come away from watching the full thing without having a slightly more nuanced understanding of Islamic State's inner workings. Of course, it's not an objective look at their inner workings. So Vice makes really compelling documentaries, but we can't focus solely on the end product, and we can't put ethics aside. We have to ask, who got the footage, how did they get the footage, and who it serves. So the big question I would leave you with then is, does providing viewership to a group like Islamic State do the public a service, or does it do Islamic State a service?